You now have a good sense of how discrete trial training works. And in the last unit, you learned how to use an error correction procedure for when students make mistakes. Well, in this unit, we're going to turn our attention to how ABA teaching makes use of prompts to help students learn new skills. Well, what are prompts? Prompts are a specific form of assistance that a teacher provides during a trial to help the student get the right answer or perform a behavior the correct way. You know, on the way over here today, I was thinking about prompts, and I was reminded about teaching my young son the Pledge of Allegiance several years ago. When he was learning, he would start, "I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America," and then he'd pause because he forgot what was next. So I provided a prompt. "And to the republic," and then he'd chime right in, "and to the republic for which it stands," and so on. Well, that's what I mean by prompting, providing a cue to help the student respond correctly. Now, I should tell you, I didn't always have to use that much prompting when he got stuck there. Eventually, he got to the point where I could shorten the prompt. I would only need to say, "and to the," and he'd finish the rest. Well, later, I only needed to say, "and to," and he'd be okay. And then later, and then that was good enough, until finally he could say the pledge on his own with no prompts. Well, what I did there was something that we call fading of the prompts. We'll talk more about that later. Now, what I just talked about was an example of just one type of prompt, a verbal prompt. Actually, there are many ways to prompt, and in ABA-based interventions, we often need to use prompting methods to help children learn. Well, some students need a lot of prompting, and others don't. But our ultimate goal is to have a child perform a skill with no prompts, that is, independently. Now, one last point before we move on. As you certainly know by now, reinforcing correct responses is key to strengthening skills we're trying to teach. Well, one of the benefits of a well-designed prompting program is that it keeps students making correct responses by reducing errors. Errors usually lead to more errors, but prompting often keeps errors from happening in the first place. So the fewer errors a student makes, the more correct responses the student will make, and that means more reinforcement for strengthening that skill. So let's learn more about prompts. So what exactly is a prompt? Well, a prompt is a form of help or assistance that's used to get the student to make the correct response if the student doesn't do so on his own. Now, prompts are used as a temporary addition to teaching procedures. When students begin to learn a brand new behavior, prompts are very useful as a teaching aid to help the student actually perform the correct behavior. Then you can reinforce that correct response, and the response will be strengthened. Now, importantly, we only want to use the amount of prompting necessary to get the correct response. So we have very precise ways of gradually removing prompts that we use. And we'll talk more about this later in this unit. But in this section, I want to go over the most common types of prompts that you'll use in your work. Verbal prompts, like the one I used with my son to help him with the pledge. Gestural prompts, that is, pointing to cue the correct behavior. Physical prompts, where you gently guide the student into the correct behavior. And modeling, providing the student with something to imitate. It'll be your supervisor's job to give you a detailed prompting plan to follow. And you'll use prompts and also fade these prompts according to the student's specific learning needs. But exactly which prompt to use and when to use them will be written out for you in the student's teaching plan. Now, let's move on to the next 4 segments where you'll learn about each of the prompts. Now, to help describe the different types of prompts that are used in ABA-based teaching interventions, I think it would be helpful to hear about them and how they're used directly from one of our more experienced paraprofessionals. So I've invited Caitlin back to do just that. Welcome back, Caitlin.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Caitlin, tell us, what is verbal prompting?
Verbal prompting is essentially a way to let the student know what they're expected to say in a particular situation.
Okay. And when might we use a prompt like verbal prompting?
Verbal prompting is typically used when the student is required to give a verbal response. So if you're asking them to say, what color is this? And they're supposed to say the name of the color. Or if you're teaching something like manners and you want them to say please or thank you.
Okay, so verbal prompt for a verbal response.
Absolutely.
All right. And in your experience, have you found that these prompts are pretty effective?
I found them to be very effective, yes. And what's nice about them, as with any prompt, you are able to fade them out so that then the learner is able to independently say what they're expected to say.
Okay, very good. And we're going to be talking about fading coming up later on in the unit.
Great.
But I'll tell you what, right now, let's watch an example of verbal prompts in action. Now, I want you to watch Melanie, another one of our paraprofessionals, who's working on one of Nathan's target behaviors, saying thank you. And we're going to see how Melanie uses the verbal prompt to get the target behavior to occur. So let's watch.
Which one do you want?
The basketball.
What do you say?
Thank you.
Good job saying thank you.
Kaylin, let's break that down. What did you see?
Great. So essentially what we saw in that situation is Melanie was expecting Nathan, after he selected an item, to also say thank you, but he didn't. So Melanie said, what do you say, in order to sort of remind Nathan or provide him with a verbal prompt to say thank you.
Okay, now I can't imagine that little Nathan's going to go through the rest of his life having to have somebody say, what do you say?
Right. So again, this is something that can be faded out systematically so that then in other social situations where it's appropriate, Nathan will be able to say thank you without the help of someone else.
And that's a good thing.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I'll tell you what, let's look at another example. Now this time we're going to see Melanie again, but she's going to be working with Megan at snack time. And as you'll see, little Megan sometimes doesn't use her words to request things. So Melanie's going to use a verbal prompt to get her to do it. Now watch for how Melanie does that.
Which one do you want? I want.
I want popcorn.
Good job asking.
Okay, so what's going on in that one, Caitlin?
So what I saw in that example was essentially the student had learned to say, I want, and then the name of the food item that she was consuming at snack. But in this particular situation, she pointed instead of saying what she wanted. So sort of as maybe a correction procedure and also as a verbal prompt, the instructor said, I want, to remind the student to say, I want popcorn.
So prompts can be used if the answer is incorrect or if the student makes no response at all.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, very good. Now, why would we even want to teach her not to point and to use words in the first place?
Well, that's a great question, and I think that when we're teaching, we always sort of want to think about the natural environment. So, for example, if that student or a student who was of a similar profile was maybe out at the mall or at a restaurant, instead of pushing past other people perhaps, or getting agitated, trying to point at items and not being able to sort of express what they really want, it's much more efficient for them to be able to use their words and just label the exact item that they would want. So we always sort of want to think about the bigger picture outside of the classroom.
Okay, very good. Thanks a lot for that.
Sure.
Let's take a look at gestural prompts in the next segment. All right, now we're going to talk about a different kind of prompt, gestural prompts. Tell us what those are, Caitlin.
So a gestural prompt is something that a teacher or an instructor might use if they want the student or the individual to respond in a way that doesn't involve them using their words. So let's say if you want an individual to pick something up or get something, you essentially are just pointing to whatever you want them to do or whatever you want them to get.
Okay, that sounds good. Let's go right to an example.
Great.
This time, Melanie is teaching Nathan to follow the instruction, wipe your mouth. We want that instruction to be followed with the correct behavior, that is, using a napkin. Now see if you can pick out the gestural prompt in this example.
Nathan, wipe your mouth. Good job.
Okay, so what's going on in that example?
So in that example, the student is having a drink and needed to wipe his mouth. Clearly he knows how to wipe his mouth because he started to do so using his hand. So his instructor reminded him by using a gestural prompt that he needs to use a napkin by pointing to the napkin, which he then followed her point, picked up the napkin, and wiped his mouth correctly.
Okay, now I noticed that the teacher didn't say anything during the prompt. Is that common with gestural prompts?
That's common, and that's actually exactly what you want to do, because you ultimately don't want the student to rely on someone else telling them what to do if they aren't supposed to be giving some sort of verbal response.
Okay, good. Let's look at another example. Now this time you're going to see Melanie again, and she's working with Megan during art time. Megan's working on a connect the dots activity. Well, let's just watch.
Wow, that's pretty. Now let's connect the dots. Nice job.
So what do you think about that one?
I thought that was another great example of using gestural prompts. The student, it looked like, was having a difficult time following the numerical sequence and connecting the dots in the right order. So rather than the instructor telling her, find the number of the dot that she was looking for, she just gave her a gestural prompt, and the student was able to follow that prompt to connect the dots in the correct sequence.
Okay, and so again, we didn't see the teacher say anything during the prompt.
Exactly, and the student was still able to follow that prompt, will not sort of develop any sort of reliance on a verbal cue from anyone. And I think that in this situation, a gestural prompt is actually a little bit more clear, because the student didn't have to continue to scan the paper to find the correct dot.
Yeah, I agree with you. Well, next up, we're going to look at physical prompts. All right, let's talk about physical prompts. Caitlin, tell us what they are.
So physical prompts are essentially when the instructor sort of very gently with their own hands guides the individual to complete an action. These are typically used when you want the individual to complete an action that's maybe a little bit more complicated. Say if the individual is carrying something that might spill, or if they need to press down on something hard enough to engage in the correct response, say coloring maybe. So that's sort of what they are and when they might typically be used.
Okay, very good. Now, as usual, we're going to take a look at an example. And in this one, Megan is painting a wooden house, and she's pretty into it. But the teacher knows that according to Megan's teaching plan, Megan needs help to wipe the excess paint off of her brush before using the brush to paint the house. Now watch how the teacher uses the physical prompt.
Watch me. That's the way to do it.
So what was the physical prompt there?
So in this example, the student received a physical prompt from the instructor while she was wiping some of the excess paint off of her paintbrush onto the lip of the cup.
All right. And would you say that this was a good use of physical prompt in this particular case?
Yes, definitely. I think that if she had received a gestural prompt, it would have been a little bit unclear what the expectation of the student was. Does a point to the cup mean pick up the cup? Does it mean tap the cup with the paintbrush? I think that would have been a little bit vague. Additionally, I think that a verbal prompt would have taken a little bit too long to explain, because it's sort of, like we said earlier, a more complicated physical action. It involves pressing down just hard enough to get the paint off of the brush without actually knocking the cup over. So I think that this was a great use of that prompt.
Not to mention that using the physical prompt in this case allow the student to continue the action uninterrupted.
Absolutely. Physical prompts, really you sort of want the guidance that you're giving the individual to more or less be an extension of their own body. So it's very gentle, it doesn't interrupt the flow of their action at all.
Of course, like other prompts, we'd ultimately be fading this one out.
Definitely. Absolutely. Yep. And that way the student is able to learn how to complete the action independently.
Okay, well let's take a look at another example. This one involves Caitlin working directly with Megan, helping her to sharpen pencils. Caitlin, why don't you go ahead and introduce this one?
Fabulous. So in this example, she's learning how to sharpen a pencil. She hasn't really mastered the skill, she isn't sure, and again, it's a little bit of a more complicated physical action. She needs to know how hard to press the pencil into the sharpener so that it sharpens the pencil without jamming it. Additionally, if she doesn't push hard enough, the blades won't start spinning inside of the sharpener. So again, a very good opportunity to use a physical prompt to teach the skill.
Well, let's take a look at it.
Nice. Very good. Nice job, Megan.
Okay, well that was really good. I love the way you were gentle with the physical prompt.
Yes, always, absolutely. Sort of like what I said before, you're really just guiding the individual to complete an action. So you really just want to help them enough that they can do it.
Okay, well there's not much more to be said. That was pretty simple, and let's move on now to modeling prompts. All right, the last type of prompt that we're going to review here is the modeling prompt. Now, Caitlin, tell us what that is.
Modeling is essentially sort of acting out whatever you want the individual to do, or basically just providing them with something to copy.
All right, and how are they used?
They're used when the learner already has all of the prerequisite skills that they need to either complete the action that you're imitating or to essentially do whatever you're acting out for them.
And I think that's best illustrated with an example. And you may remember this one because you're in it. You were helping out Nathan to do some drawing. Tell us more about it.
So sort of like what I just said, Nathan had all the prerequisite skills necessary to draw a diamond. He knows how to hold a marker, he knows how to draw, he knows what a diamond looks like, but he just needed a little bit of help remembering the actual shape of a diamond when he was drawing it by himself.
Okay, well let's take a look at it, and then we'll talk about where the prompt was.
Would you draw a diamond? Your turn. That looks great. Nice job. Perfect. That is a diamond.
Okay, where exactly was the modeling prompt in that example?
So I asked him to draw a diamond and he did not respond, so I gave him a model in which I drew a diamond for him that he could then copy.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's watch another example. Now, here you're going to see Nathan and Melanie in the play area. Nathan has been playing with foam puzzle pieces during his free time, and Melanie comes over with a toy bin and tells him it's time to clean up. Now watch how Melanie uses a modeling prompt to help Nathan do the correct cleanup task.
Nathan, it's time to clean up. Clean up. There you go.
Okay, Caitlin, let's talk about the modeling prompt in that example.
Great. So again, a very good use of a modeling prompt. That student already knows how to clean up, so that behavior is something that's already in his repertoire. So when she told him to clean up and he didn't, she picked up the blocks and put them into the container just to remind him what to do.
Well, that was modeling, and that was the last of the different types of prompts that we're going to be reviewing in this section. But I want to thank Caitlin for taking the time to come by and help explain it all.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, you're very welcome, and I know we'll see you again. Now, those are the 4 types of prompts: modeling, gesturing, physical, and we started with verbal prompting. I would encourage you to go back and take a look at the examples again, because there's a lot there. But if you're ready, let's move on to talk about fading out the prompts. Now, as I mentioned earlier, prompts are used only when needed. The goal of ABA-based teaching is to remove prompts as soon as we can without disrupting the student's learning. We introduce and remove prompts gradually so that students learn successfully but do not become dependent on the teacher for help. To promote the student's independent performance, prompts are removed by a number of different prompt fading procedures. So what do I mean by fading? Fading is a process where we gradually change how little of the prompt that we use. We do this in a way that ensures the student still receives the help he or she may need, while also promoting greater independence. Now again, fading a prompt is done very gradually. In the next segment, I'd like to show you an example of gradually fading out a verbal prompt using another learning object. You'll be able to see exactly how the prompt is used at the start and how it's faded over the course of multiple sessions to let the student respond more and more independently. So just click through the boxes that you see and you'll see the progression of fading. Well, that is the first unit on prompting and fading. At this point, you should have a pretty good sense of what prompts are and what fading is all about. Providing assistance to our students in the form of prompts is not only very common, it can be a pretty powerful way of teaching. But always keep this in mind. Prompts are a temporary tool in our teaching arsenal. Our goal is to have our students perform whatever task or skill they're learning as independently as possible. And the way we make that happen is by using fading procedures that are carefully designed to gradually change those prompts. What those procedures look like is the topic of our next unit.